Good evening and a warm welcome to the London Ambulance Service annual public meeting. And firstly, I'd like to apologise for the slight delay we had at the last moment, some technical issues. In the light of current circumstances, we are hosting this event virtually to most of our board and guests for the first time. So a very warm welcome to everybody who's tuned in. This is being live streamed, so will be available later to view. And we would like to remind you that you can ask questions. You can do this through slido.com using the code #58137, and that should be coming up on your screens, or #LASPM. Thank you. We're incredibly proud of what our staff and volunteers do across the Trust, and this includes our crews, our call handlers, fleet, technicians, logistics, supervisors, our support staff, and everyone else who's worked incredibly hard through a very difficult year. And we don't do this alone. We do it working closely with our partners, other providers, charities, and in the case of this year, the Fire Brigade, the AA and paramedic students. So they do an enormous amount to help us. But it's also been a very sad year, and we've had a number of staff who have died. And I would like us to take a moment to reflect on our staff who sadly passed away during the last 12 months, to think about them for a moment. And so I'd invite you to join me in a minute's silence to recognise them. Thank you. I'd now quickly like to take a moment to introduce members of our board, firstly by introducing Garrett Emerson, our CEO, and then I will take the other members in alphabetical order. So Tricia Bain, who's the Director, Chief Quality Officer, Lorraine Buse, Chief Finance Officer, Professor Karim Brohi, Non-Executive Director, Fergus Cass, Non-Executive Director, Amit Kutty, Non-Exec Director, who is also new to our board but joins us having been an Associate Non-Executive Director since October 2017 and became a fully fledged non-exec in February. Jane Mee, Non-Exec Director. Kadir Mir, our Chief Operating Officer, who this time last year had just joined us. A welcome to Rommel Pereira, who is a non-exec director. He joined us at the end of February. Dr. Mark Spencer, Dr. Fenella Wrigley, who is our Chief Medical Officer. And in attendance, we also have Ross Fullerton, Director of Strategy and Transformation, Anthony Tiernan, Director of Communication and Engagement. And not with us this evening are Sheila Doyle, Dr. Sheila Doyle, a non-exec director, and Jill Anderson, our new Associate Non-Exec Director. I'd also like to take the opportunity to introduce Dame Christine Beasley, who has been appointed as Chair of the Public and Patient Council. Thank you. We now need to take the minutes of the meeting held last year on the 24th of September. And for those who are here, can I ask if they are an accurate record of the meeting? And if I start with page 1, page 2, and I think that is it. It ends on 7. Can I ask board members if that is an accurate recollection of our meeting?
Agreed.
Okay, agreed. Thank you very much. So before we do the statutory, financial and quality accounts, we would like to introduce you to some work we did last year that prepared us, we feel, for COVID and our COVID response, which we will also talk about. So I'd now like to hand over to Dr. Fenella Wrigley, who's our guest speaker, with Archana Matter, who will talk about the perfect day, which we did with North East London Commissioners. Thank you. Over to you, Fenella.
Thank you. The North East London Perfect Day on Monday the 30th of September 2019 was a collaboration between London Ambulance Service and North East London Sustainability and Transformation Partnership, supported by Healthy London Partnerships. The day sought to test whether, by integrating and connecting health and social care services effectively, as is outlined in the 2019 NHS Long-Term Plan and the LAS strategy, we could ensure that no matter which number a patient called to access care, be it 111 or 999, they were not unnecessarily passed between different health and social care services, received the appropriate clinical care for their needs and where appropriate were treated closer to home, and the number of times personal and clinical information had to be repeated was reduced. The day built on the concept of a perfect week, which is frequently undertaken in hospitals to utilise all possible resources and streamline pathways to assess the impact on patient journey and staff processes, but importantly also to identify gaps that we may have and better ways of working going forward. Perfect Day was, we believe, the first true system-wide integrated model of service delivery, which saw urgent and emergency care partners involved in North East London. It included London Ambulance Service, emergency departments, urgent treatment centres, GPs across North East London, crisis mental health services, the physician response unit, rapid response services and community health and social care. Historically, 999 and 111 services provided by London Ambulance Service have run independently of each other, often resulting in multiple transfers of care for patients and frequently defaulting in the patient being conveyed to an emergency department. Emergency departments are not always the best place for a patient to receive care. So from 8 o'clock on Monday the 30th of September for 12 hours, our 999 and 111 call handlers and clinicians were fully integrated. We had a co-located multidisciplinary clinical team carrying out clinical assessment for patients with non-life-threatening illnesses and injuries, for example, abdominal pain, chest infections and back pain. It ensured that patients received the right care first time from health and social services. What was critical was engagement with London Ambulance Service clinicians and wider partners, and this was integral to the success of Perfect Day. We'll now hear some thoughts of colleagues involved in delivering the day.
We just went to a 49-year-old lady who had a 2-day history of right flank pain associated with pain on going to the toilet. We have saved an ambulance for this lady, and although she still ended up going to the emergency department, it was the most appropriate route of care for her after we spoke to her own GP.
So today we've just been to our first patient, which was a 7-year-old boy with breathing difficulties. He has known asthma, but from our examinations we've been able to find that his breathing actually wasn't too bad, and we've called a GP appointment for him to sort of keep him out of accident and emergency, and yeah, his appointment was very quick. The GP was quick to ring back to us, so yeah, he's going to be sorted today.
Today I'm in the caller colleague desk for Perfect Day, and we're taking calls from staff in the North East of London to provide them with clinical support and decision making on where to take their patients. I've just had a colleague call me about a patient who had numbness in their hand. We were able to dispatch an APP urgent care to SEAM to assist them in their decision making skills. So it's early days, but it looks good so far.
We were asked to come and see a 14-year-old boy who had some learning disabilities, making a transit to hospital potentially very upsetting and disruptive, and also logistically fairly difficult. And we were able to assess him at home, including doing some blood tests and a wider impression of his home environment, which made us confident we could help and leave him at home, which was really valuable for particularly him, but also for his family.
Now we'll have a little look at some of the outcomes of our Perfect Day. So by working closely with community health services, social care and GPs, London Ambulance Service assessed and treated more patients at home, which helped to reduce the emergency department crowding. Overall, on that day, only 49% of patients who made an emergency call were conveyed to hospital by ambulance. This is 9% fewer than on an average similar day. This importantly meant that more ambulances were available for patients with life-threatening emergencies. Other key outcomes for the day were that we confirmed through the pilot that there was a proportion of patients calling 999 or 111 who can be safely managed after a telephone clinical assessment by a doctor, nurse or paramedic without a conveyance to an emergency department or onward transfer to other healthcare. Importantly, there were no complaints and no clinical safety incidents. Another area that we talked about a lot last year at the annual public meeting and is very much a focus is delays to hand over patients at the crowded emergency departments. And on Perfect Day, we saw a reduction in delays for patients between the hospital and the ambulance crews, again increasing our availability for patients to for ambulances to attend our sickest and most seriously injured patients. Importantly, Perfect Day also identified areas for further development, which includes an ability to end-to-end trace the patient journey. As a clinician, knowing that you made the right decision for your patient is the most powerful learning tool. To further facilitate this, following Perfect Day, the development and deployment of an electronic patient record system has been expedited. And as we roll this out, that feedback to our clinicians will be transformative in how they provide care. We've seen greater integration of the 111 and 999 services in North East London, including the co-location of multidisciplinary clinical teams. This had previously been delivered as two separate teams. And we've also identified that we could reduce the number of patients who needed to go to an emergency department, reduce the number of face-to-face attendances using digital technology, and improve the experience for patients. A number of the initiatives that we used on Perfect Day have now been embedded across London. Collaborative work with the NHS system partners resulted in the establishment of a 111 and 999 transformative board so that we could take forward this integration work. The learning from Perfect Day was invaluable during COVID-19, where rapid mobilisation of different clinical models was required to maintain safety and high quality of care during unprecedented demand. It enabled us to safely increase the number of patients receiving hear and treat care, which supported London having capacity for those patients needing hospital care. Many of the infrastructure changes made during the Perfect Day were retained and again were crucial in our response to COVID-19 pressures and are now embedded as everyday practice. So in summary, Perfect Day was one day, but what it demonstrated for us is that by adopting this responsive, coordinated, system-wide health and social care response, the vision of integrating care for patients is possible, and every Londoner can receive the right care in the right place at the right time. I'm now going to hand over to Archana Mather, who is the Director from North East London Commissioning, to talk about the experience that they had as a North East London team.
Thanks very much, Fenella. I'm delighted to be invited to the London Ambulance Service annual public meeting. My name is Archana and I'm the Director of Performance and Assurance for the North East London Commissioning Alliance. I'd start by saying that the relationship we have in North East London with London Ambulance Service goes back many years and has been strengthened with the provision of our 111 Clinical Assessment Service contract, which commenced on the 1st of August 2018 and personally makes me and my team extremely proud. The service model has always been innovative, utilising the skills and expertise of a broad range of clinicians and staff. It's been developing ever since and plays a key role in ensuring all of our urgent and emergency care services are connected to ensure a smooth patient journey and getting patients to where they can access the right treatment the first time, and where possible, reducing the demand on our hospital emergency departments. London Ambulance Service have worked alongside us to develop these pathways, and the collaboration was truly tested when we jointly trialled the Perfect Day in September last year that Fenella has just referenced. The aim of the day was to ensure that whether a patient calls 111 or 999, they could receive the same response appropriate to their individual needs. The hope was that by testing the approach, we could collectively reduce emergency department attendances, ambulance conveyances, delayed handovers, and most importantly, improve the care and experience of our patients and staff. I was in the ambulance service call centre in Barking until very late on the Perfect Day, watching as the North East London system came together in a single effort and observing how 111 and 999 staff sat side by side instead of separately, as was the usual drill. There was a distinct buzz and a huge excitement in the air, with live dashboards measuring activity from calls coming in, watching as GP appointments were being directly booked, and whilst clinical advice to ambulance crews redirected them to less busy departments or used other out-of-hospital pathways to manage patients rather than taking them to hospital. I had the opportunity to talk to call centre staff that evening and was thoroughly impressed by their focus on improvement and commitment to making the Perfect Day a success and the immediate capture of the learning. We were all fueled in the call centre that night by a steady stream of satsumas, crisps and chocolate, and I was no exception to this. We often talk about system integration in the NHS, but rarely does one get to see the opportunity to truly see it in action. Services were all pulling together to ensure that whether a patient was suffering from a mental health crisis, it was an elderly person who had a fall or an infected wound, or whether there was worsening of a long-term condition like asthma or heart disease that a GP knows all about, all roads led to the patient being in the right place, whether they initially had called 111 or 999. This was, of course, only a day, and the initiative was repeated as a perfect week a few months later. The week saw changes in better integration and oversight of a single queue of patients who have called 111 or 999. Ambulance crews were able to directly access clinical support from GPs via the clinical assessment service by dialing *5, and there was improved access for care home staff too, amongst many other improvements. The Perfect Day and week put NEL in a very strong position to cope with COVID demand. Not at all to underestimate the pressure and commitment of staff managing significant increases in call volumes already and other pressures for other NHS partners. The Perfect Week showed that the system could work more collaboratively together, and this has led to the present North East London Urgent and Emergency Care COVID Restoration and Recovery Programme, of which London Ambulance Service partners play a very crucial part. Dr. Agatha Nortley-Meshe and Fenella work alongside our GPs, consultants and leadership team and wider system partners on an absolute timeline to test and implement the National Think 111 First programme as we see the resurgence in COVID infection. This is a series of approaches with the aim of encouraging patients to call their GP or 111 first to get advice or treatment to reduce the risk of hospital-acquired infection through crowded waiting rooms. And also using the 111 assessment service to support increased virtual consultations, direct booking from 111 into GP practices, GP hubs, emergency departments, ensuring rapid access to our community and mental health services. Whilst very pressured for all involved, again, the North East London Urgent and Emergency Care Programme demonstrates the strength of the partnership in North East London and how central London Ambulance Service are to this. I'm sure Fenella will share my intent for rapid implementation and learning from our programme to ensure better outcomes for the patients of North East London through the rising tide of COVID-19 once again. I'll just end by extending my huge thanks to partners in London Ambulance Service on the behalf of the North East London Integrated Care System for the strength of our collaboration and for much more collaboration going forward. And of course, for inviting me to share in your successes in this public meeting. Thank you so much.
Archana and Fenella, thank you very much for a very clear explanation of Perfect Day and how it has helped us work in the system. And as they say, it takes two to tango, so we're very grateful to Archana as well as to our own staff. I'd now like to turn to our Chief Exec, Garrett Emerson, who will explain how we use that and how we responded to the COVID crisis and are preparing for the next one. Garrett.
So, thank you, Heather. Before I do that and before I talk, I thought it would be probably more interesting for people to listen to what our staff had to say about the response to COVID.
The London Ambulance Service was at the forefront of responding to the COVID-19 pandemic. Faced with unprecedented demand, we adapted our service
immediately to ensure we could respond.
We saw a 300% rise in calls to our 111 service, and 999 calls grew from around 5,000 a day
to a peak of 11,000 calls by the end of March.
In just one weekend, we built a new control room and trained student paramedics to take COVID-related calls.
Using what we learned from the London Olympics, we redesigned our logistics operations to enable us to deliver over 1 million items of PPE.
And with the support of the AA,
we were able to keep London ambulance vehicles on the road.
We also prepared 200 additional ambulances
to be ready to respond.
With the London Fire Brigade, we trained 300 firefighters to support our clinicians, including driving our vehicles to ensure we can have as many crews as possible on the roads, going to people who needed us across London.
We redeployed qualified staff to frontline roles and recruited and deployed over 900 temporary staff and volunteers.
From airline staff to software engineers.
This was a challenge like no other.
Thanks to the commitment and effort of all in our service.
And the many organisations who supported us.
We ensured we were there for London
when it needed us most.
As I'm sure you can see from that video, it was an incredible challenge for the London Ambulance Service, and one that ultimately we faced and rose to successfully. And indeed, the organisation was described by the head of National Director of Urgent and Emergency Care, Pauline Phillip, as being a COVID success story. But it belies the challenge that we faced in the early months of this year. And of course, it was a challenge and ultimately a triumph that we faced in the face of some significant adversity, and of course, a considerable amount of tragedy in the nature of this indiscriminate killer disease. COVID-19 came to the UK first in London and came in a considerable wave. And the nature of what we do in London Ambulance Service, both in our 111 services and in our 999 services, meant that we were at the very cutting edge of responding to it, seeing our peaks in demand several weeks in advance, for example, of the acute system, and indeed several weeks more in advance of the rest of the country and our other colleagues in other ambulance services. We had to respond fast. We had to respond very quickly. From the beginning of March, it was clear that we were potentially going to lose a significant proportion of our own staff to COVID sickness and self-isolation, while dealing with potentially twice the volume of demand for our services that we've ever had to face before. That's a mountain to climb. And that is something that this organisation faces and deals with on a regular basis in terms of short-term incidents, in terms of major incidents, in terms of responses to emergency and tragedy. But to face it on the scale of something like COVID, for the duration that we had to do that, required a totally different approach. Ultimately, though, it came down to just three things. It came down to, could we find enough capacity and enough people to be able to answer the phone, whether that's in 999 or 111? Could we find enough vehicles, enough ambulances to be able to respond to our patients on the road and on the ground? And could we find enough clinicians and other staff to man them so that we could continue to meet that demand and get to every patient and deliver the quality of care that is expected of us day in, day out? Taking that first challenge then, As you heard in the video, we rapidly expanded our call answering capacity in 999 and 111, looking at innovative ways of using volunteers, using staff that we could recruit quickly, some staff who've been furloughed. We were particularly helped by the airline industry, who from the beginning of lockdown obviously furloughed a large number of staff, many of whom had customer care skills, some of whom had clinical skills, paramedic skills and so on, that we could quickly train and redeploy into our 111 services. In 999, literally over the course of one weekend, we designed and built and implemented into operation an entirely new and additional COVID-specific call handling hub staffed by second year and ultimately first year student paramedics, because with their degree of clinical training they already had, we could train them very quickly to be able to answer and deal safely with COVID-specific calls, allowing our full-time staff to answer the myriad of other demands that are still being placed or still were placed on the service. And we saw those huge volumes of calls that did indeed double in 999 and did indeed treble in 111. And finally, we strengthened our clinical assessment teams, because with the advice and guidance and indeed the very understanding about the nature of the disease changing daily, we needed to provide the very best clinical advice to our call handlers and indeed our patients. Turning to the second challenge on my next slide, the challenge was, how could we rapidly find more ambulances? Typically in London, on a busy day, we would look to provide about 350 to 375 ambulances available across London. The nature of COVID meant that we felt that we would need to provide anything up to 650 vehicles. That required a totally different approach. That required running our existing vehicles on a virtually 24/7 basis. We needed to keep our workshops open to do mechanical maintenance and repair. We needed to dedicate our own specialist staff to the specialist parts of the ambulance equipment and vehicles, and therefore we needed more technicians and mechanics. So we turned to the AA, who were able to partner with us and very quickly made available over 170 of their technicians in London, who were no longer as busy on the road repairing day-to-day cars and so on because of lockdown, and had them both in our garages and on the road, keeping our vehicles running 24/7. But that alone wouldn't have been enough. We needed more vehicles and we needed them fast. Fortunately, we had about 60 vehicles that were in the process of being built and completed over in Southern Ireland. We worked with our suppliers to bring them into service incredibly quickly in just 3 weeks rather than 6 months. And we also sourced another 50 or so second-hand vehicles to bring them back into service, and converted some of our non-emergency vehicles to be able to provide emergency service work. And overall, we were ultimately able to provide over 600 vehicles and transform our logistics operation to support them, to allow us to put ultimately 600 vehicles out on the road every day to respond to that increasing demand. Finally, of course, the challenge was to make sure that we could staff those vehicles with clinicians and indeed with other staff to be able to drive and support those clinicians on the road. Key to that was, on my next slide, working to bring back into the service a number of additional staff, former staff that have worked with us, other volunteers, our emergency responders, simplifying our operational model so that a lot of our single responders in motorbikes and cars and bicycles joined their colleagues in full-size ambulances to work in pairs to increase the number of vehicles we had. Bringing in third-year student paramedics in their final year of their degree to work alongside qualified paramedics, and probably most visibly and significantly working incredibly closely with the London Fire Brigade to bring in ultimately over 400 firefighters who stepped in with their particular skills around being blue light trained to drive our vehicles and having the right licenses and so on, but also having been trained in basic life-saving skills by ourselves as part of their day job. They were able to very quickly be familiarised with our vehicles and deployed onto our ambulances, which enabled us ultimately to deliver the vast numbers of ambulances we needed to meet that COVID challenge. So in summary, and on my final slide, in the space of just 6 weeks, we were able to massively transform both the nature and the scale of the operation and the service we provided to Londoners. Effectively, we grew the size and scale of the service by around 20% inside 6 weeks. It's a massive achievement by everybody in the organisation. I want to pay huge tribute to every part of the business, whether it's frontline crews, call handlers, control centre staff, our fleet and logistics people who did amazingly, all the people in our back office service, corporate operations who redeployed, the people who worked to support the welfare of our staff throughout that period, and to recruit all those additional staff. Around 900 additional staff came on board. We deployed over 200 additional ambulances, an increase of over 50%. And in doing all that, we also played a very significant part in the wider NHS response to COVID, providing all of the transport services to enable the NHS Nightingale at Excel to get up and running so quickly, setting up a brand new Nightingale-specific ambulance service station in just 3 days. And all of that, of course, while managing very significant COVID absences, which every other organisation faced at that time before we got substantial access to staff testing and were able to start to bring down the number of absences and isolations we had. It was an incredible achievement. It's one that now leaves us in a very good place to deal with whatever comes, which I'll talk about a little later on in the meeting. But with that, I will hand over back to Heather Lawrence, our chairman.
Thank you, Garrett, and I'm sure that people will realise now what a complex response we had to provide. And could I remind people of the opportunity to send in questions either by slido.com using #58137 or #LASPM. Please do send in those questions. We would like to hear from you. So now we turn to the more statutory side of our report, and we move to invite our Chief Operating Officer, Kadir Mir, to talk about highlights of our performance overall, and in particular what we're here for, the innovations and care that we give to people, our clinical outcomes. So Kadir, over to you.
Thank you, Heather, and good evening, colleagues and members of the public. It's my privilege to be able to give an update on our performance as an organisation and the quality of care that allowed us to provide during 2019-20, the financial year of 2019-20. As we go through the presentation, I will try to just segment out our performance up until February, recognising that March was quite an extraordinary month. So we will probably compare performance in 18-19 to 19-20 up to February, and then a recognition that the month of March was quite extraordinary. A few key messages just before we start. As an organisation, and I'm sure it'll be known to many colleagues watching tonight, but as an organisation we employ or have the support of circa 7,600 staff in the Trust. We have circa 5,000 staff working in ambulance operations and circa 1,700 staff working in either our 111 integrated urgent care services or our 999 control rooms. We also have circa 150 staff working in fleet and logistics. On average, we receive circa 5,700 calls to 999, circa 3,500 calls to 111, and that has grown to up to 6,000 calls on occasion during some of our busy periods recently. And we attend face-to-face incidents of circa 3,500 incidents a day. I've been in the organisation 12 months, and it never ceases to I never see it stop to be overwhelmed by how phenomenal the service that we provide is. And just a reminder to colleagues and members of the public watching that if you are requiring an emergency response, for example, for a heart attack, across London, 650 square mile, you are never more than, on average, 7 minutes and sometimes 6 minutes away from a life-saving response from the London Ambulance Service. Coming on to some of our performance in 2019-20. In 2019-20, we took 2.1 million calls, and that was an increase of circa 8% on the previous year. We took in the region of 1.2 million calls in our 111 integrated urgent care services, which again was up 58%. Now, a huge amount of that increase was in the latter part of the year and close to, obviously, the peak of COVID. And we attended and saw face-to-face incidents, face-to-face patients across London, 1.2 million face-to-face incidents, and that's 3.5% above 18-19. So in all elements of the organisation, wherever we are providing a service to patients, be it on phone in our 111 services, on phone in our 999 services, or face-to-face, we saw growth in demand for our services. If that's the demand, then let me just take you through some of the performance in terms of how we responded to that. So in terms of performance against national standards, there's two key standards that as an ambulance trust we focus on measuring our performance against, and they are Category 1, mean response time, and Category 2, mean response time. Now, Category 1 is the emergency response, and the national standard is 7 minutes, and Category 2 is the so Category 1 is a life-saving response, and Category 2 is the emergency response for conditions such as stroke, and that standard nationally is 18 minutes. You'll see on the table on the screen that the national standard for 7 minutes, in 18-19 we performed under 7 minutes, in 19-20 we also performed under 7 minutes, even taking into account the extraordinary pressures we saw during the latter part of 19-20, February and March, where we saw extraordinary demand, as Garrett, our Chief Executive, has set out. In relation to the emergency response and the national standard of 18 minutes, in 18-19 we performed an average of circa 19 minutes. Now, up to February of that of 19-20, we were performing at a similar level, just slightly over at 20 minutes, and that went out for the full year to 23 minutes, but largely driven by that extraordinary month of activity in March of the year. In terms of the volume of activity then that we saw and how we treated patients, we often focus on 4 key areas. How many of those patients we saw and treated over the phone, how many of those patients we saw and treated at scene but didn't convey, how many of those patients we conveyed in total, and how many of those patients we conveyed to an ED department. And I'm pleased to report that across all of those figures, we aimed to increase the number of patients that we were able to see and treat over the phone or see and treat at scene, and reduce the number of patients that we conveyed to an ED or another setting in order for us to provide the best care as local to the patient as possible, primarily in their home wherever possible. So all going in the right direction. In relation to some of our challenges, the next slide, winter pressures always presents a challenge to the London Ambulance Service. During the winter months, we see demand for our services go up by, on average, 10%, but during some of the busiest days and busiest weeks of the winter period, up to 20%. So all over 1,000 more calls potentially on days and weeks during the busiest period of the winter. And we take pride in how we prepare for winter, both within the organisation and how we prepare for winter working with our partners, both the hospitals across London, but also the commissioners and our regulators. And we did that again in 1920, and I'm proud to say that we were seen as a key partner in winter planning and winter preparation across health and care across London. In addition to those preparations, when we did start to see handover delays, challenges in hospital departments where the volume of activity that they were experiencing was presenting them with challenges, we deployed our teams to those hospital settings to support them to reduce their handover delays, both in order to provide good care for patients in those ED departments, but also to be able to release our crews to get back on the road and be able to see other patients. And it was a real success and recognised as best practice across London. We also sadly had to attend two terrorism attacks during the year of 1920. The first was the London Bridge attack on the 29th of November, and the second was the Streatham attack on the 2nd of February. In relation to London Bridge, there were 6 casualties that were assessed on scene and 3 were conveyed to hospital. And in relation to the Streatham attack, there were 3 casualties were assessed and conveyed to hospital. I'm proud to say that our crews and our response was exemplary, and I'm proud to say that we were fast and effective in the care that we provided and the lives that we saved in response to those terrorist attacks. Some of our notable successes for the year we've already mentioned already mentioned and discussed the Perfect Day, and I'm really pleased to have been part of that and for the organisation to have demonstrated what's possible when we work in partnership with local commissioners, providers, and it really was a springboard for the further and greater integration work that we've been conducting during the remainder of 1920 and into this year. We also launched the Good Sam app, which allows immediate life-saving care from community volunteers, and the service contributed to, as a minimum, the survival of 40 additional people through the use of that app and the resuscitation available through public access defibrillators. I'm also proud of the work that our mental health team has led in piloting mental health joint response cars, and we now have these in every ICS integrated care system across London, where we're able to respond to incidents. And we responded to circa 2,000 incidents through the mental health joint response cars, and only 4% of those that we treated at scene were needed to attend an emergency department subsequently. So huge improvements in the type and form of mental health care that we were able to provide. And finally, it's really important that as part of all of this work that we've taken a proactive approach to supporting our staff and well-being, and we've been taking a public health approach to offering multiple innovative and free of charge services to our staff, including the South East London Diabetics Online Self-Management Programme and We Are Undefeatable, which is a support service for staff with long-term health conditions. So with that, I'd commend that to this annual public meeting. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I just want to take a moment to say thank you to our emergency voluntary responders. We have about 150, and they very much help us get to those cardiac arrest cases quickly that help our response. So a big thank you to all of you if you are listening. We really value what you do. And interestingly, we're getting a lot of interest from people post-COVID from all sorts of backgrounds. Historically, mostly it's been off-duty police, fire officers, but we're getting bankers and all sorts of people. And if you watched our television programme, a plug for the third one will be at 9 o'clock tomorrow night on BBC One. Last week you saw one of the voluntary responders, and in fact he was somebody from a bank. So do watch, it's interesting. And if you are interested, get hold of Anthony Tiernan, our Director of Communications. Thank you. So moving over now, I'm going to hand over to Lorraine Buse and Tricia Bain, who will talk to us about our financial and quality performance, which is part of our statutory duty too. So over to you, Lorraine.
Thank you, Heather. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to start with a financial overview of last year before I present the accounts. 2019-20 was clearly an exceptional year, and it ended with the suspension of formal contracting and financial plan targets to respond to the ongoing challenge of COVID. But prior to the pandemic, it was a year of significant financial challenge, and it was a considerable achievement that the Trust was on track to deliver the control total before the pandemic led to the suspension of financial targets. Notwithstanding this, London Ambulance Service increased its income, continued the diversification of its funding streams with additional funding from North East London and South East London integrated urgent care services, and continued to invest all available budget for capital for the benefit of our patients. And as we look ahead to this year, we have successfully made the case to more than double our capital programme in 2021 to consolidate some of the transformation that has been engendered by COVID. So if I may turn to my formal duty this evening to present a highlight of the accounts for the year ended 31st of March 2020. I'm pleased to report that the London Ambulance Service met all of our statutory financial duties for 1920. Our capital cost absorption rate was on target at 3.5%. That is, we delivered the expected rate of return on investment set by the Department of Health and Social Care. We significantly came in below our external financing limit, which is the way the Department of Health controls cash, and we generated £10 million more cash than planned. We fully used our capital investment budget, spending 99% of our capital resourcing limit. And we had a small, but larger than planned, operating surplus for the year, thereby meeting our break-even duty. Finally, we saw a modest improvement in settling non-NHS invoices by volume and are continuing to improve the speed at which we pay such invoices in terms of both volume and value. On income, our total income for the year was £439 million. 999 income made up the vast bulk of this at £389 million, or 89%. And that's down 4 percentage points from last year, reflecting some growth in other income streams. Of particular note is the rise in our South East London and North East London 111 service contracts to 4.4%, or £19 million. We also saw a significant £12.2 million in pension contributions central funding to reflect the rise in employers' contributions to NHS pensions from 14.3% to 20.6% from the 1st of April 2019. And lastly, we were awarded some £6.8 million of funding to cover additional COVID-related expenditure in 2019-20. Moving to capital. Capital investment saw £22 million in 1920, supporting a wide range of projects, including more double-crewed ambulances, the refurbishment of our headquarters, which made possible consolidation of our office space requirements and future reduction of operating costs. The start of the move to electronic patient care records, which will enable greater integration of health and social care, with the London Ambulance crews being able to send information ahead to receiving hospitals or to better share information with care homes and local GPs when they treat patients on site. Our planned investment for 2021, which is the largest in our history and nearly double previous years, builds upon and continues these investments, especially in consolidating our training estate and office requirements, improving our control rooms and oversight of logistics and medicines management, and supporting greater integration of health and social care, all with the aim of improving our patients' care outcomes and the safety and well-being of our staff. Lastly, our external auditors have concluded that the accounts present a true and fair view and have issued the Trust with an unqualified audit opinion. They've confirmed that the Trust met the unqualified value for money conclusion and found that it had proper arrangements in place to secure economy, efficiency and effectiveness. Accounting for the costs of COVID and suspension of the normal contracting and financial arrangements has posed a number of problems for all of the NHS, with uncertainties over property valuations, stock counting and going concern. And in a number of trusts, this has led to auditors modifying or even qualifying their opinion on the accounts. I am pleased to confirm that our auditors have not modified their opinion of our accounts, and I'd like to take this opportunity to commend my finance team for this achievement. The full set of our annual report and accounts can be found on our website under Publications, and I'm pleased to commend these accounts to the meeting. I'd now like to hand over to our Chief Quality Officer, Dr. Tricia Bain.
Thank you, Lorraine, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's always a pleasure to share the progress we've made on our quality improvement plans year on year. Just to say, I will be sharing highlights of our quality account, but you can see the full account with all the detail on our events page, which will be shared on our website. But I would like to firstly thank all of our staff, our patients, our stakeholders for helping and supporting us in our improvement plans through the year, which has been particularly stressful, certainly at the latter end of this year. I'd like to first go on to the safe and effective domains. Early in 2019, we identified issues with our security of our premises. Our Chief Exec, Gareth Emerson, launched our It's OK to Challenge programme. And we are pleased to say that when we look at our compliance against the checks we make regularly across the organisation, over 90% of our stations are now secure, but we continue to work to make sure we will get 100%. I think, as you know, over the last few weeks and the sad news and media coverage, that violence and aggression towards emergency services is a really significant issue, and it's one we take very seriously. We are one of the first ambulance trusts to recruit 2 violence reduction officers who support staff in taking forward successful prosecutions. We have seen a 4-fold increase in those prosecutions this year. Importantly, we are also launching our body-worn cameras programme. The first part, funded by NHSI and E, will start in November, but the board are fully committed to funding the full rollout of body-worn cameras over 2021 and to the end of this financial year. Clearly, our staff lift patients, they lift heavy equipment, and a significant incident reporting is around manual handling injuries, and we have taken forward a programme of work, and what we have seen is a reduction in working days lost in relation to manual handling injuries from 17, I think it was 4.08 per thousand to 3.23 now. But again, that's an area that we'll continue to focus on. In terms of patient, again, we were the first ambulance service to implement the National Patient Safety Investigation Framework and train over 100 staff in investigations. And clearly, when you read the account, you will see the improvements we've made, particularly in areas such as managing cardiac arrests, managing our emergency calls and how we dispatch our calls. You've heard from Chief Operating Officer and Fenella against Perfect Day in terms of our handover to green, and that's when our staff hand over a patient to an emergency department and then make themselves available for the next call. And again, we have seen significant improvements in those rates, and particularly even during COVID, from 17.2 minutes to 15.8 at year end. Moving to caring and responsive. As our Chief Operating Officer talked about our mental health response cars, which have made a significant improvement in the care that patients who have mental health crisis receive from our staff, and significantly reducing their conveyances to emergency departments. Similarly, we've had the same sort of approach to patients who are at the end of their life. We have a team of end-of-life specialists who work with our staff and train them in managing these very sensitive situations. And we have seen a real increase in confidence in the way in which our staff manage this certain scenario. But we've also seen a reduction in the conveyance of patients at the end of life. And we're now seeing around 10% of those patients being managed at home, which is really an excellent result for the patients and the family and carers. Our aim this year was also to improve our response to complaints, which we have done from 68% to 77% within our 35-day target. We had a pause on our complaints during COVID, and so we continue to work to improve that further. And I think importantly, we've launched our Ambulance Service Public and Patients Council, chaired by Dame Christine Beasley, who is here tonight. And that is really important in terms of listening to a wide variety of information, data, advice from our patients, particularly in terms of how we develop our services. And importantly, today we agreed our patient engagement strategy, which sets out 7 priorities over the next year to take forward. Moving on to the well-led domain. I'm really pleased to announce that we maintained our good rating with the CQC. And as you heard from our Chief Operating Officer, from Fenella, our Chief Medical Officer, the innovative work we did around integrated urgent care, that also received a good rating from the CQC. Clearly this year it has been stressful. Our staff do deal with very stressful situations in the normal day-to-day, and we have really increased the amount of health and wellbeing programmes we provide to our staff in the organisation. So we now have health and wellbeing hubs, and we have now just introduced an app that monitors proactively our staff's health, and we can feed them the information back so that our staff are directed to appropriate pathways much more quickly. And as also Kadir said, we have maintained our positive indicators against performance, but also our quality indicators. And we have also introduced quality improvement hubs, which we are now taking forward across all sectors and services in the organisation. Our Freedom to Speak Up Guardian has won an award, and that really does reflect our improving culture around speaking up and the ability of our staff to share their concerns with the organisation. And again, our staff survey had a significant increase to 71% this final year, which was great, and we are clearly trying to improve that on this year's staff survey. But also importantly, we have also launched our Staff and Volunteer Advisory Panel, and that is chaired by Heather Lawrence, our chair. And again, it really is important for our staff to share how they think we can improve, get involved in those improvements, and that has been running over the last few months and will continue to do so. We also played a leading role in the London Digital Board, taking forward many digital technology innovations, and as you've heard, we are now currently running our electronic patient care record. And obviously we do continue and have seen much progress against our quality and diversity programmes. Looking forward, you have a list of the priorities that we are now going to take forward next year. We will continue on our medicines management improvement, and that's really around making sure we have the correct estate to make sure our drugs rooms are secure and easily accessible and monitored by our staff, that we clearly have the right skill mix and resources as we are expanding our services, our integrated urgent care, and moving into making sure we meet the ongoing demands of the service. We are also developing the paramedics in the primary care networks. So again, it's really important that we continue to monitor progress against that and make sure we evaluate those programmes. We will continue advanced aggression. As I've said, we have made progress, but there is still a lot to do, and it is really important for us to do so. And we will also continue developing our health and wellbeing packages and programmes of work for our staff. Embedding the culture is clearly a critical and a priority programme for our organisation, and we've done much work, but again, we will report that in next year's quality accounts. And clearly you've heard all the learning from COVID and the experience we've had will continue to feed in the development of our services and any future high peaks in demand that we are potentially going to experience. So, in conclusion, I'd like to say we have made significant progress as this organisation does year on year, and we will continue to strive to improve the quality of care, the safety of care to our patients, and also the safety and well-being of our staff through our 2021 programme of quality improvement. Thank you.
So, Tricia and Lorraine, thank you very much for two very clear presentations, most helpful. I'm now going to hand over to our Chief Exec, who's going to talk about really what's next. Garrett.
Thank you, Heather. Well, what's next indeed? I mean, what an incredible year, what an incredible 18 months really, as we've attempted to cover both the full financial year that this annual public meeting relates to and the response to COVID, which obviously cut across the end of the financial year. It knows no boundaries, be they financial or otherwise, and continues to be with us today. And you don't have to go too far in the media to understand the real and present risk that COVID continues to pose. We continue to maintain our readiness to respond to whatever demand is required of us, both in relation to COVID-19 itself and, of course, in relation to the myriad of other needs that Londoners have of both 999 and 111 services. And as we head into what could potentially be a challenging winter for the NHS as a whole and for the ambulance service, we remain remain on full alert. We have all of the resilience that we built up that we talked about earlier, the continuing ability to put many extra ambulances on the roads and to answer many calls in both the 111 services and 999. And to give you some context to that, our busiest ever days across the winter, we see around up to 7,000 calls in 999 services, and our peak demand, specifically in March and April relating to COVID calls only, was about an additional 3,000 calls. So we are ready and able, and we have the capacity to respond to over 10,000 calls if needed. Now, that's not to say it will be needed. That's not to say that we're expecting necessarily to see that kind of level of demand. But as an emergency response service, we have to be ready to respond very quickly, because as we saw back in March, there can be precious little warning of the ramp up of, be it COVID or indeed flu outbreaks or indeed any other type of emergency response that the organisation needs. So we remain ready, and at the same time as doing that, we're working ever more closely with the system, the wider healthcare system, as you saw with Perfect Day, to integrate what we do with what the rest of the urgent emergency care system does across London, and that is involving us in delivering, as Lorraine, our Chief Finance Officer, said, probably the biggest capital programme of investment that we've ever made in transforming everything from our frontline operations to our control centres, our call centres, our training facilities, our logistics, and investing in protecting our staff with body-worn camera technology, as you heard from our Chief Quality Officer, Tricia Bain. So it's an incredibly busy time for us across the service, but we continue to make sure we're ready to serve Londoners whenever and wherever they need us.
Thank you, Garrett. So it's nearly time to answer the questions that you've posed for us. But before I do, I would like to just again thank all of our staff and the volunteers, the first responders that I mentioned previously, who together volunteered nearly 23,000 hours and went to nearly 12,500 incidents. We can't thank you enough, and we are very grateful to have you. And as Garrett said, we want to thank our partners. We can't do what we do without working with them, and that includes the blue light partners, particularly when we have terrorist attacks to deal with. Integrated care, as Garrett said, is a major area for us to focus on, getting over the point that we do urgent and emergency care, not just provide ambulances. And this is really important to the future of care in London and for the outcome for patients. So my last thank you, which I nearly forgot and nearly always do, I want to thank a big thank you to our communications department and Bobcat Productions, who have helped us put this programme together. These things don't come together without a lot of work, and we're very grateful to you all, so thank you. I'd now like to turn to the questions, and we are going to probably take those in groups. You can still send questions in. But the first grouping, and I'm going to ask board colleagues to answer different ones, is about low traffic neighbourhoods. And before I do, I will ask Kadir to answer them, but Kadir and I attended London Council's meeting on traffic issues only this last week. And we are keen to work with them, but we did make the point, from our perspective, it has to be about patient safety and staff safety first. But there was a very positive meeting to help us work in the future going forward. So from Councillor John Ball, following Ealing Council's consultation, are we now content that the LTN arrangements provide safe access for the LAS? Councillor Joanna Dabrowski, sorry if I've pronounced that incorrectly, have the LTNs across Ealing caused any delay in getting an ambulance through the gridlocked main arterial roads, and making the point that 2 fire vehicles couldn't get through a gridlocked Uxbridge Road for a while? Councillor Susan Hall, leader of the Conservative group on London's Assembly, would like to know if any of the LTNs are causing problems and response times. Another one from Ealing, from Scott Christie Jones. What impact has LTNs had on your services, especially considering Ealing not consulting us? But I think we've moved on from there on their implementation. And another one, As somebody with a chronic illness, are there any plans to get vehicles with suspensions? And he thanks us for saving his life a few times, so thank you to you too for that. So, Kadir, are you ready to answer those questions?
I am, Heather. Can colleagues, members of the public hear me? Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the question. In response, we're working incredibly collegiately with local government partners across London and with GLA partners. We're not aware of any LTNs that have led to any patient safety concerns or any significant delays. We are monitoring it closely, but we are also keen to work very collegiately and collaboratively with our both emergency service, but also our health and care partners across London. So, as Heather said, we prioritise patient safety, and we prioritise our response times above anything and everything else. We're not aware of any significant issues at the moment, and we're keen to continue to work collaboratively to be able to work through any potential implications of any LTNs. And in relation to Ealing specifically, we've been working closely with the council subsequent to the scheme that was put in place in order to make sure it doesn't have an adverse impact. And I understand that now we've got in place an agreement that, as opposed to fixed and permanent bollards, etc., there will be it will be managed and monitored through cameras, which will allow our vehicles to be able to pass smoothly and appropriately.
Moving to more general questions, and I think, Kadir, you'll be back on in a moment. How many ambulances were put on divert in South West London this year? And is there any impact analysis on patient outcomes? And I will just group these. Can the sirens for ambulances be changed? Feedback from Australian friends who say it hurts and can be quite frightening. And lastly, why are ambulance drivers with long experience working for NHS TUPID over to G4S? I don't think we... Kadir, can you come back, please?
I can. G4S. Just making a note. In relation to the question of diverts, I'm not aware of any significant issues in relation to hospital diverts in South West London and any particular impact on our ambulance services or in South West London or our crews. I'm happy to take that away and look at any specific issues. It's fair to say that the ED departments and the hospitals in South West London perform incredibly well in terms of their 4-hour waits and their handover time. So I'm not aware of any specific issues or incidents, but happy to take that away if that's helpful. In relation to G4S, I'm not aware again of qualified staff, colleagues in the organisation who have been TUPI'd over to G4S. I'm happy to look into that. We've had some colleagues recently TUPI'd into the organisation from a private ambulance provider, but I'm not aware of any being TUPI'd out or us losing any. But happy to pick that up. Always interested in additional qualified and experienced individuals working for the London Ambulance Service. There was a question about suspension earlier. Unfortunately, our ambulances work to a specific specification, and I know being in the back as a patient or as a passenger can be bumpy. I think our crews do everything they can to ensure the smoothness of the journey. But as we continue to iterate and develop our future vehicle requirements, perhaps that's something we can take away. I know it's not always a smooth journey to hospital. Can you just remind me, Heather, of any? I think there was one other question that I've not answered.
Oh, the sirens. Any way
sirens.
we can solve the siren noise?
So, I have made some inquiries while we've been on the APM. But our sirens are dictated by European regulations in terms of sirens for emergency vehicles. So it's a European standard that we work to and that we're compliant with. We have changed the tone on some of our newer ambulances recently, and we're trialling that at the moment, so happy to provide some feedback on that. The final point is this does seem to be an issue or an issue that's generated some concern in London, and I wonder whether it's because of the fact that we are much more, much denser geography than other parts of the London. Siren noise doesn't seem to be something that my colleagues across the country have been experiencing, but I recognise that there's been some concerns in London.
Thank you. We now have a question on staff assaults from Councillor Susan Hall, the Conservative Group Leader of the London Assembly. Tricia, I'm warming you up to answer this one. The simple answer is yes, but Tricia will be able to tell you more. Sadly, the question is, would we be able to let her know if there's been an increase on attacks to our responders? I take that means to all the people who respond on an ambulance. Unfortunately, it's happening to other blue light services. So the answer is yes, but Tricia, are you there to give a bit more detail, please?
Yes, we have seen an increase in violence and aggression incidents on our staff. We saw a reduction during COVID because clearly there wasn't many people on the streets at that time, but now we are seeing that going back up. I think we're increasing, if my memory serves me right, and I will give you the accurate figures, but we are seeing about an increase of around 5 to 10 violence and aggression incidents per week compared to this time last year. So they are going up, but clearly, as you've heard, we are taking this seriously and are doing everything we can to support our staff and working really closely with the Metropolitan Police in terms of their Operation Hampshire programme that they have taken forward to reduce violence and aggression. So the answer is yes, and we are doing everything we can to support our staff.
Thank you very much, Tricia. And now turning to a question about diversity and also staff retention. What is the organisation doing to address issues of racism that have come to light in the media recently? And from Brendan Lewisham on Slido, what work is being done to recruit a diverse workforce to make LAS look more representative of the London it serves? And the staff retention one is LAS planning to improve frontline retention? Is a rotational paramedic programme as trialled elsewhere across EOC, UCC and Road planned in the future? So I'm going to kick off on diversity and then hand over to our Chief Executive. This is something we take terribly seriously. We take it seriously for a whole host of reasons, and it does link to, does our staff represent the population of London, which Garrett will come on to. But we have issues that our staff who are out on the road, how the population of London respond to them, and that can be in a racist way. And we do record that on Datix, but we need to get better at how we support them. And we have had issues internally. The board has had feedback from staff of how it is to be them in our service. And we have taken a range of action. In fact, today in our board, we had a board paper, both in the open bit and in the private bit, on the detail of that. We take it very seriously, and there is tremendous work being undertaken. Garrett.
Thank you, Heather. I would echo that this is a major area of focus for both Heather as chairman, myself as chief executive and the board as a whole. And this is something that isn't new. This is something that we have been focused on for several years now. We obviously work to develop and deliver as part of the wider work that the NHS has been doing with the National Race Equality Standard, and we have specific targets to diversify our workforce and also to improve the equity of the experience that colleagues have across the organisation from whatever ethnic background they're from. In relation to the diversity of the workforce, we face a significant challenge within the organisation. London is probably one of the most diverse cities on earth. 43% of our population is from a black and minority ethnic background, and as we know, the city speaks anything up to 300 languages from people who've literally come from all around the world, or indeed have been born and lived all their lives in London. The London Ambulance Service is not as ethnically diverse as that by some way. We are about 17% black and minority ethnic across the organisation. The reasons for that are fairly long and complicated, and indeed that number varies widely across different parts of the organisation. The principal challenge for us is around the paramedic element of our workforce. Around a third of our total employee register are paramedics, not surprisingly. and the graduate paramedic population in the UK is actually not anywhere near as diverse as the population of London. So we're recruiting around a third of our workforce from a cohort of graduate paramedics who are only some 10% ethnically diverse, and we're trying to achieve 43%. So that is a challenge for us and explains some of the reasons why our figures are not as high as they are in some other parts of the NHS. But on top of that, as I said earlier, the real challenge for us is to improve that workplace experience, and many of the initiatives in the Workplace Race Equality Standard Action Plan over the last 2 or 3 years have been designed to do that, to bring in initiatives like mentoring and reverse mentoring, to encourage development and role model colleagues who have succeeded across the organisation. I think the events of 2020, though, and particularly the tragic event following the death of George Floyd in the USA and the Black Lives Matter movement, caused us as an organisation and as a board and as an executive team to re-look at and redouble our efforts to tackle racism and race equality issues in the organisation. Some of you will have seen, I'm sure, communications that both myself and the chairman on behalf of the board have sent both internally to all of our staff and externally in the wider media, redoubling our commitment to tackle racism and race inequality. Some of the, I'm not going to go into all the things we've done because there are a myriad of things, but I think one of the most significant things we've done over the last 2 or 3 months has been to engage all of our frontline managers. That's down to first line management level. That's some 700 members of staff in core managers sessions around race and race equality to equip them to better have that conversation with frontline teams at whatever level. We are all, as managers, we're all managers of one team or another, from myself leading my executive team where we've had these sometimes difficult conversations about race and ethnicity, down to clinical team managers and shift managers in call centres and control rooms. Having those same conversations, tackling those issues, and I think as an organisation it's enabling us to break a taboo about being uncomfortable to talk about racism in the organisation and therefore tackle issues. So not surprisingly, we are dealing with a number of issues that have been raised either by black or minority ethnic colleagues or indeed by white colleagues in the workplace that hitherto they haven't felt confident or comfortable to address. So we are now tackling those issues, and I believe that will put us in a very strong place going forward to really be a leader in the field of race equality and to tackle some of those challenges that we know exist in our organisation because we know they exist in society. And what we now have to do, I think, along with some other key taboos that we have to break down, such as talking about mental health and dealing with issues in relation to that, that we can do the same in relation to race and make London Ambulance Service an even better place to work.
Thank you, Garrett. And just on staff retention, are we planning a rotational programme? Is that a yes or a no for
Yes,
paramedics?
we have a rotational programme and we're planning to expand it.
Thank you. So turning to the perfect day, so Fenella, be ready. In the perfect day results, we said it ran from 8 to 8 instead of 8 till midnight as previously reported. If the results are for 8 to 8, were reduced conveyances compared to the whole 24 hours, compared to the 8 to 8 period, where GPs or UCCs are open and accessible, urgent care centres, I should say. And from Councillor Vivian Littlechild, can this process genuinely be a full-time arrangement to ensure patients go where they should go to for treatment? Fenella.
Thank you, and thank you for the question. So what we reported was the 8 till 8, which was when all of the pathways and all of the systems were able to be delivered. What we extended it to midnights, but many of the pathways were not able to be open up until midnight. So for the analysis, we used the 8 till 2000 hours. Could this be replicated and rolled out? Yes, absolutely. We saw much of it during COVID, where the increased hours that GPs were offering, the ability to get appointments booked throughout an extended period of the day was absolutely paramount to being able to make sure patients were accessing care in the right place. There are certain groups of patients which we would need to model to understand whether there was an economic value and a patient outcome value to having it for the periods in the early hours of the morning. Generally, if a mum rings because a child's very unwell at that time in the morning, then being able to take them to a place where they can get definitive care rather than booking an appointment is often needed. So it's about looking at what's needed for each group of patients and working with each of the local pathway design groups to understand what's needed for their patient group rather than making it a one-size-fits-all for London.
Fenella, thank you very much. That's most helpful. Now, we are beginning to run out of time, and I would like to turn to Dame Christine Beasley, Chair of our Stakeholder Engagement, to answer the question from David Burbridge. Given that you're a London-wide service, how do you work with Healthwatch, which is a local service? Christine, can we find you on the Zoom? She's not there. Oh, Christine, we seem to have lost you. Let's turn to Anthony then. Anthony Tin, Director of Communications and Engagement Strategy. Anthony, can you answer that question? Thank you.
Hi, Heather. Yes, thanks for the question. Yes, we work with Healthwatch in a number of ways, both London-wide and at a local level. So at a local level, our local sector teams would work with local Healthwatch, being involved in the work that they do. At the London-wide level, we join on a regular basis the London Healthwatch Network. And actually, we recently joined and gave them a detailed update on our response to COVID. The local Healthwatch are also involved in our London Ambulance Service Public Patients Council, which launched earlier this year. Off the top of my head, I think there's 6 London-based Healthwatch on the council. I know that does include Haringey, Merton, Sutton, and others. So those local Healthwatch are a part of that council and helping to inform and influence our work in terms of the way that we engage the public and patients. And we're also working with a number of local Healthwatch on a couple of other initiatives. One is we're developing a visits program. So this is where accredited groups of patients and patient representatives would visit our services and give us constructive feedback that we can learn and develop from. And we're also working with a number of local Healthwatch on a program to look at the care we provide to pregnant women so that we can learn and develop from that. So working with local Healthwatch at both a London-wide level and at a local level.
Anthony, thank you very much. Sedi Frederick, who is Chair of North Mid, how nice to have you on the call with us. You've asked a question, did we work with St John's Ambulance? And there is another question about the military. So Garrett, could you answer that, please?
During COVID, yes, London Ambulance, St John Ambulance, I should say, provided a significant amount of support to us, both through the National Strategic Reserve team, which I think consisted of about 100 ambulance crews that were deployed across the country, several of which were deployed into London to support us, but also more locally in terms of the work they did working alongside us. And indeed, to this day, we still have St John colleagues working with us on the, for instance, managing the staff testing regime to ensure that we get staff who exhibit COVID symptoms tracked and tested quickly. And the military, not so much significant involvement in the military. We had military liaison with us all the way through in all of our leadership team meetings and so on, who provided invaluable support around a range of specific issues from equipment for ambulances and so on. The most significant bit of partnership they did was work with us on the critical care transport services to and from the Nightingale Hospital.
Thank you, Garrett. Now, there are many more questions, and what we need to do is commit to answer those by email to you separately, but I think I would just like to read out some comments that have been given in praise of our staff. Stephen Waring said, Kadir, excellent performance, particularly the increase in see and hear and treat, reductions in conveyances. Also, the terrorist attack performance is exemplary. Mark Hanser, the innovation and diversity LAS used to respond to COVID-19 is outstanding. John Bruder says he agrees, quite remarkable. Mark Hanser, Garrett, thank you for mobilising the very best for London. Councillor Caroline Calu, well, all for the job well done, all the time, both seen and unseen. Arif Mahood, LAS is one of the great, excellent and largest emergency services of the world. Hanif Khan, thank you to the service you do for our nation. And Sedi Frederick, on behalf of his board at Northwood, thanking us from his colleagues. That's really kind of you. Ruth Appleton, hi to all LAS for the dedication to the NHS. And Councillor Susan Hall, an incredible service, thank you. Somebody has just said, were we going to give a shout out for first responders? I'm sorry if you missed it. It has happened twice. We are truly grateful for your service. I'm now going to turn, just lastly, before we close, I think it's important sometimes to recognise staff for their exemplary service. It's very difficult because, as you've seen from the comments in, all of our staff make an amazing contribution. But tonight we would just like to draw your attention to 3 members of staff. The first, I'm sorry to embarrass you, Fenella Wrigley, our medical director, but Fenella has been appointed by Her Majesty the Queen, who is the sovereign head of the most venerable order of the Hospital of St John of Jerusalem, as a commander in the said most venerable order. So well done to Fenella. And then we would like to commend Amanda Cassidy, one of our EOC dispatchers. And again, if you've been watching, or if you did watch the first episode of our ambulance programme the week before last, you will have seen Amanda there. She shared with us her very sad story of her teenage son being stabbed to death, aged 19, and her decision to take that very traumatic experience and turn it into an opportunity to make a difference to London. So Amanda's efforts at the service to improve the health and safety of Londoners doesn't stop at her role. After seeing knife crime growing in the capital, Mandy volunteers around 30 days a year in schools, talking to children about the dangers of knife crime. So well done, Amanda. And then I'd also like to take a moment to recognise one of our managers from North East London, IUC and 111, Maria Qureshi, Maria, whose continued dedication to the performance of North East London 111 IUC and her ability to continually go above and beyond to support staff in encouraging a freedom to speak up culture, in boosting morale on the toughest of days, and in putting the health and well-being of her staff at the forefront of operations in North East London, is a demonstration of true leadership. So to Marie, thank you very much, Maria. So sadly, we have now run out of time. So I'd like to thank you all for joining us to hear about the journey of LAS during the last year, to hear about our COVID response and our performance overall. I'd like to thank you for your forbearance with us, for the questions that you raise. And we hope very much that next year we'll be able to meet in person. So until then, take care and thank you very much. Good evening.